Good evening, listeners. This is George with the Vanguard. This evening we're going to discuss abortion. What inspired me to discuss this proximately was actually an article that was saying that because the Biden campaign isn't talking as much about abortion as other Democrat campaigns have in the past, that maybe a lot of so-called pro-life conservative voters are actually more comfortable voting for Biden because he embraces a consistent life ethic, or because, whatever they come up with, that maybe he's not as anti-life because he claims to be Catholic or whatever. We're going to dispel a lot of those myths about his particular position and the Democrats' position in general on abortion itself. We're going to talk about some of the things that they support with regard to abortion. Also, though, more broadly, we're going to debunk the idea that abortion is morally neutral, or sometimes maybe people say it's not the most important part about being pro-life. We're going to debunk that really quickly. We're going to debunk the consistent life ethic, or at least discuss some of its flaws. And we're going to talk about the upcoming election. And shortly after this has recorded, we're going to hear a vice presidential debate between Kamala Harris and current Vice President Mike Pence. So we're going to discuss how that might be affected by this. So we have a guest, in this case, the Wolf, who talks a lot about abortion. And then I also have my co-host DJ Trump joining a little bit later. So I hope you guys strap yourselves in. This is going to be exciting, interesting, and perhaps a bit controversial.
Well, let's just dispel with the notion that Joe Biden has a moderate position on abortion. Let's even dispel with the notion that Joe Biden is going to be president in any meaningful way. Because you know who doesn't have a moderate position on abortion? You know who tried to put David Daleiden in jail for exposing Planned Parenthood to protect her blood money? Kamala Harris, his vice president, who is going to be the de facto president. So, frankly, Biden's abortion position doesn't even matter. It's in the position of the party. The position of the party in Harris is more what matters. But really, Biden doesn't matter. And the other stupid thing that he does is he does this, oh, I'm Catholic, oh, I have a rosary on me thing. And the thing that worries me is it's going to win him the Catholic vote.
That is a legitimate concern, because I would say any legitimate reading of Catholic doctrine, and again, for any of our listeners, you want to look this up, feel free. Look up, you can look at it in, I would Google the Catechism of the Catholic Church if you want just an easy source, but I mean, pretty much this has been consistent throughout the Church's existence. So, I mean, just in order to dispel any notion that Biden is being honest about his alignment with what would be the Catholic position, abortion was never acceptable. I mean, that was something the Church never really accepted. And, of course, many voters don't really care about that. But for those who do think that somehow this is in line with their faith, if they are Catholic, I would encourage them, just always go to the sources, actually understand what you're talking about, and understand the decisions you're making before you make them. And again, for me, that answer is going to be, if you care about what the Catholic Church says, I mean, I would read that and say you can't, in good conscience, vote for him or for anything that his party is putting forth. And I think also it's important to note that there's a lot of frustration, actually, at least insofar as I've seen, from a lot of Catholics, not just our friend here, the Wolf, but also just a lot of average voters, people who may consider themselves on all ends of the political spectrum on many issues, but who find effectively the whoring out of the Church by someone like Biden, or at least the image of the Church, whoring out that image to this political party, because really, it is interesting. There are a lot of accusations thrown around that the religious right, whatever that might be, more broadly, tries to blackmail people into voting for Republicans because of religious concerns. But it is interesting that the appeals that conservatives tend to make, and not always, but usually, tend to be more about issues, as in, this is something that this particular religious group cares about, and this is our issue that shows that we are on the right side of it. It's not this mushy crap of, I'm a nice guy, doesn't God want you to be nice? I mean, that's basically the attitude that a lot of people on the left have when they make their pitch. It's usually not about issues, or at least if it is about issues, it's about issues in a misleading way of how they might apply to actual religious doctrines. And I would say it's worst with Catholic doctrine, but even other Christian groups, you can see sort of the bastardization of their beliefs by Democrats more than by anybody else. And I think that's another important point to note, is why this is so pernicious, and why, even if you're not a Catholic, just your interest in truth and in honesty should annoy you substantially, or should be annoyed when you hear Biden talk about his devout Catholic faith, if he ever had that. But yeah, anyway, that I think I agree with the Wolf on that. So I'd like to draw our attention to an article that I saw a couple days ago, and we're going to be discussing this a little bit. It's basically this idea that somehow Biden is moderate or whatever. And one of the things that's interesting that we saw, and that I found very disturbing, but that is worth looking at, I'm going to read you an excerpt of it. Recently, the New York Times interviewed such a Republican voter, meaning a Republican voter who apparently feels more comfortable crossing party lines. And the quote from this voter is, "You'd think I'd be glad to hear that Trump nominated a judge who's pro-life, but I think what we need more than anything else is someone who's broadly pro-life, not just worried about the unborn, but about the living." And then two women, apparently, who are pro-life, or claim to be pro-life and used to be Republicans, and were at a Michigan Democrat event, said, "I've had it with this idea that you're only pro-life if you fight against abortion. I can't be that single-issue Republican anymore." So I guess my question to the Wolf is this. I think that there's obviously a legitimate concern about people who are both in the womb and not in the womb, and the majority of us are out of the womb, and obviously our needs matter, but is there not a difference in kind here? A difference, like a fundamental difference between merely helping people who are alive, that giving them food, giving them opportunities, etc., versus preventing people of all kinds, whether out of the womb or not, from being murdered? I mean, that's to me the first thing that jumps out here, and the first fallacy that seems to be put forth here is that, oh well, it's the same to feed. It's every bit as bad not to give the poor enough food as it is to actively kill an unborn child. Does that strike you as one of the big problems here?
It's completely absurd. I was talking a couple years ago. I went to the Fox News studio and I met with Tucker Carlson, and Tucker told me one thing that was very interesting. He said, "I agree with you on this issue. You can't kill people. It's that simple. You can't kill people. End of story. It's that simple." And regardless of whether you're giving them food, it's just a cop-out. Just because I don't give somebody food doesn't mean you can kill them.
Oh, yeah, keep going.
It's a simple concept. Just because I don't give somebody food doesn't mean you can kill them. And actually, I do give people money. When I was in college, there were homeless people all around town, and I would always interact with them. And I definitely believe in there's more to, and I theoretically believe in there's more to being pro-life in a way than just saying about abortion. However, what Jesus told us to do is he never said ask the government to serve your neighbor. He said serve your neighbor. So just you're not voting for whatever liberal program there is, that regardless, you might not think it works because it probably won't. That doesn't mean you're not pro-life, because if you're out there and actually helping people instead of just telling the government to do it, then that's more important than telling the government to do it. And I would actually say telling the government to do it is a cop-out and a dereliction of the duty that we have.
I would agree. And I think you're also getting to the point that there are levels of obligation. So I think, and this is something that I'd be interested to hear your explicit views on, because I think we agree on this. I'm just curious to hear how exactly you view it. My understanding is that the obligation not to, and of course, and I want to be very clear, and this is just because I'm an anal kind of guy, I really have to get into the details of everything. It is interesting to me that these, particularly Democrats for the most part, a lot of them don't even think you should be able to kill people in self-defense if the situation isn't super, super clear. If it's not so clear that you're probably already dead by the time you'd be making the decision. But they believe you can kill an unborn child who's not threatening you in any way. Of course, I mean, that to me is a bit illogical. It's not even just about, choice, because, apparently my choice to protect my own life is not quite as important as a woman's choice to kill an unborn child who might be inconveniencing her, but is likely not threatening to kill her. And then the other thing to me that I'm kind of trying to parse out is my view is that there is a hierarchy of obligations. Of course, yes, you are obligated insofar as you are able to provide for those who cannot, and to share your resources insofar as you can with those who need them. But I would say that it's even more important and even more immediately maybe ethically urgent is maybe the best way to describe this, not to be killing other people when you don't absolutely have to. To me, that's the very first thing. That's the bare minimum. You can't worry about feeding the poor if you're out there. I mean, if I just shoot my neighbor because I'm pissed at him, does my feeding the poor balance that out? No. Similarly, I don't think that, any kind of, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say they're out there feeding the poor themselves. Let's say they're using their own money, or they're helping a food pantry, or it's something that doesn't involve the coercive nature of a welfare program funded by government money. Let's say it's personal money, like their personal money. Even then, I don't think killing an unborn child gets wiped away just because they fed some poor people. As important as that second step is, the first step to me is an even more morally significant issue.
Of course. Because the thing is, poor people, rich people, anybody, they can't exist at all if they've been killed. And the right to life among natural rights is the first among them, which means it's the most important among them, which means that it has to be protected under all circumstances. And I found it very interesting when you said about how some Democrats think you can't even kill a born person in self-defense. And I was actually getting a little bit worried that you were going to talk about the Democrats' views on fetal personhood, because I actually believe that no one actually believes that the fetus isn't a human. That's an excuse. That's a cop-out. The question is whether you can kill them anyway. And that's the depraved part about the new move in abortion politics is there's sort of a, yes, it might be, like, even if it is a human, we don't care, and the woman's choice trumps that, which that's just a dumb way to look at things. It's not moral in any way, But to say you don't have an obligation to not kill, because that's ultimately what they want, is they don't care how much you do to help people either. They just want to do away with the obligation to not kill. So what you're saying, it actually agrees with them in a way, in these other issues are kind of irrelevant on both sides.
Yeah, I would agree. So, because I think what we need to unpack here is that, yeah, fetal personhood, and not to get, inane about it, but so fetal personhood can arguably be separated from, whether it is a living human being. Ooh. And we are actually getting somebody else to join us. We're going to have another one of our great guests. So just a second. I'll finish my point. So, DJ Trump, are you there?
Yes, I am. I couldn't miss this conversation.
Okay, so I would like to say, so this is The Wolf, our other guest, and then I will introduce you, The Wolf, to DJ Trump, my co-host. So he had to be a little late, but yeah, I'll just keep on going into the point I was making, which is that technically you can separate the concept of personhood from even human life, but I would argue that taking away personhood, that effectively it delegitimizes the life. It's very hard for me to think of any situation in which at least some form of personhood, maybe not all of the rights. For example, we don't give kids the right to vote, and that is I wouldn't consider it a natural right to vote, but at minimum it's something that our full citizens should get. But again, the concept, you don't get to kill kids. Now, Peter Singer, an infamous philosopher, might argue that killing a young child who has less sentience than a pig might be okay. But I don't think we're going to be arguing for that, and I don't really think that's worth entertaining as an argument for the purposes of this episode. But I think
none of us are strict utilitarians.
Yeah, the other thing is, the question is, does utilitarianism does it have to extend to? I will admit, I'm not philosophically a utilitarian at all, but I think there are plenty of arguments that animals don't get to count toward utility, but that their utility doesn't matter. But anyway,
the argument is that if the essential moral question is pleasure or pain, then any individual or any entity that could feel pleasure or pain is morally relevant. So that creates some obvious problems. Like, what about humans in a vegetative state? Do they have any moral value? And the obvious utilitarian answer would be no. And there's also the hypothetical utility sponge of somebody who can feel greatly versus somebody who doesn't feel that much. It's a very strange system.
And of course, the last exception I'll add there is, what about minorities? The majority might love to exterminate minorities, but are we going to say that that's something that is morally acceptable? I think that...
most people who are serious utilitarians will make the argument that in the long run, if you look at the societal impact of allowing one group of people to annihilate the other, it leads to a society that is less happy and less prosperous for everyone, because once that precedent's set, it's hard to put that back in the box.
That sounds awfully like rule utilitarianism, which seems ethically and logically sketchy at best. But I think we'll move on from this conversation, but I appreciate you bringing that up. So, since we haven't really heard too much about your specific views on this issue, I'd like to forward you an article, and you can take a look at it, and particularly a couple of excerpts from it. Have you read the article, DJ Trump? I think we may have discussed it beforehand. If not, I will send it to you now. But basically,
I need to know what the article in question is.
It's basically about because even though the Democratic Party is more clearly pro-abortion than it ever has been, it is basically currently making getting a lot of supposed pro-life voters, because those voters are thinking that maybe it's not so big on abortion just because Biden merely doesn't talk about it quite as much. So,
right. This is the wider phenomenon we see across many issues. The pro-life issue is one of the most visible ones. But a lot of people who are voting for Biden and who see him as a moderate aren't looking at his platform and his promises under any means. They just think orange man bad, and Biden just shuts up about all the controversial policy because that's not what's going to get him the election.
Yeah, so I guess, and now you have the article in case you want to look at the specific information. But we're also, the Wolf and I have been sitting here trying to dispel some of the myths that Biden's a moderate, or that we've been trying to dispel what, and I will say particularly in Catholic thought, and this term has actually extended far beyond Catholic thought into the general conversation of the U.S. society, at least I would say, the whole concept of a consistent life ethic, or whatever garbage people come up with. And we're really trying to dispel that, and we haven't actually mentioned it by name yet, except just now, but we've sort of established, I would say, the hierarchy of moral responsibilities. You know, how much more important it is not to kill somebody versus how important it is actively to give that person some kind of help. So, and I know that I've been talking a lot, so the Wolf, do you have any new things to say based on what has just been said, or anything else you haven't gotten the opportunity to say yet?
Well, I love that you named it consistent life ethic, which is just about the dumbest thing ever for two reasons. One, it's the distraction, and two, there can be fundamental disagreements. There can be disagreements about how to best apply a principle in policy. An example of this is immigration, because the consistent life ethic people, they say, oh, open borders, you have to open the borders. But if you actually look at what's going on at the border, if you look at all of the trafficking, there is human trafficking with people being exploited by predatory traffickers, and then when they get here, they're often exploited by predatory corporations to be like, we need someone to mow lawns or whatever, and we're going to pay them below minimum wage, and there is nothing they can do about it because they're immigrants. But at least we let them come here. At least we let them come here. We open the borders because that's the pro-life thing to do.
I would also add, because for one thing, you are pointing out, particularly with illegal immigrants, absolutely, they can be exploited. It's very, because they can't, if they complain, they can get reported, and they will get deported if they are reported. And quite frankly, that's fair legally, but again, it's an understandable problem. I can see why that's such an unpleasant situation for them and such a really problematic one. It's also, though, important to consider, what does that do to our citizens? Whenever you make it harder for people to have meaningful work because they're competing against people who aren't following the rules. I'm all for, like, actual competition. There's nothing fair, though, about competing against people who, in many cases, aren't paying payroll taxes, or at least don't have to pay part of them. And that's the case with not just illegal immigrants, but also H-1B visa holders and other people, such that they can get paid less and still take home more of the paycheck. And that makes American workers who actually have to pay all those taxes less competitive. Also, it's important to note that the increase in crime in a lot of neighborhoods that particularly relates to illegal immigration, that hurts legal immigrants, native-born Americans, and other illegal immigrants alike. It's not beneficial at all. The last thing I'll note is that study after study, of course when taking into account actual overall impact and not just top-line numbers, shows that immigration in general actually is a net drain on our economy. Now the question is that always true? How can we change that? And also, perhaps, do we have a responsibility to the world that extends past our economy? I would say that there are legitimate discussions to be had about that, but I don't think it's reasonable to say that, oh, well, the rest of us need to pay a price for a bunch of other people who, in many cases, come to this country and don't always even love the country they're coming to. Now, I hate to say that, and I do not accuse all immigrants of having that attitude, but I've met far too many who just seem to see America as more of a place to rape and pillage and plunder, rather than, or at minimum, a place that owes them something, rather than a place that they want to succeed in, but also contribute to. And I think that's another thing to note, is the idea of there's this rhetoric of entitlement. And it's the same with abortion. Women feel entitled to kill unborn children they helped create. And there's nothing that we're supposed to be able to do to protect those children. That, to me, is a valid point. And I think another thing, just to subtly bring up, all three of us on this call are men. And I think that's a very important point to make here when our voices are silenced more than anybody's in this debate. The idea is, well, we can't be pregnant. Well, I mean, Julian Castro might beg to differ. But, biologically, men can't be pregnant. And apparently that means that we don't get to care about the lives of those who have not made it out of the womb yet. So that's just another thing I'll leave you guys with. So either of you guys have anything to say next?
I love that you mentioned the men, because here's the thing. The male biological, both genders, and this is just simply how biology works, is the drive is toward reproduction. That's why we have a sex drive. That's why sex is pleasurable. So when you're a man and you do this part of reproduction, and without the actual baby coming out of it, because you've had that baby killed through coercion of the woman, because that's also a big issue.
Oh, yes, that is important to bring up.
So if you've had the baby killed, then you're not reproducing, you're not doing the thing that's the reason you have the sex drive. It's literally, it's like cutting off your penis.
I think that's actually, it is a graphic, but appropriately graphic description of how illogical this is. And I do think it's important to describe not only why it's a bad thing morally to have abortion, but I think we also need to describe how it doesn't fit into the logical reason that arguably we exist, right? Part of biology is that presumably, at least insofar as we're having sexual relations, we should be reproducing as part of them. That's the logical reason that whole activity exists, why it's pleasurable, even though, not to get into too much gory detail, but technically speaking, it's actually can cause it can be a dangerous activity depending on what you're doing, and actually can cause heart attacks, actually, interestingly enough. If we want to sit here and chuckle a little bit, but it's not the, it's an activity that we would not engage in were it not so pleasurable. It just biologically, we would have no reason to do it. If it weren't for, one, the underlying reason, but the more proximate reason is, of course, it's pleasurable. However, why is it that we're engaging in this activity over and over only to literally kill the reason for that activity in the first place? And I appreciate that you brought that up. Now, just to make sure, DJ Trump, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I actually have a couple points.
I was about to say, you might have some good opinions on this. I was just thinking, the wolf got us into some good territory, I think.
All right, so first I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about the consistent life ethic, because when we really look under the hood of this, we see what I think is at the root of a lot of our political discourse and a lot of our disagreements, and really a lot of the miscommunication in American political dialogue. Now, the central issue is the difference between positive and negative rights, which many people don't understand. But when we say that you have a right to life, that translates to you are not going to be killed by anyone else. You should not have your life taken away from you. It does not mean that you are provided for. However, many people on the progressive left, many people across the political spectrum even, believe in the concept of positive rights, the idea that you're going to be provided with certain things by birthright, the idea that you have a right to, say, housing, education, healthcare, as opposed to life, liberty, and property. And the argument of people who believe in negative rights is that these rights are inherent elements of our humanity that predate any civilization or state. And the state is only created insofar as it is a tool to protect those rights. The rights do not come from the state. They predate the state. And the state has nothing to do with providing them. It only prevents people from infringing upon them. On the other hand, people who are pushing this consistently pro-life ethic, as they would call it, would say instead that you are supposed to provide for life. But it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of rights. It holds rights not as a natural extension of humanity, but as a social construct and a political construct more than anything else. And you can't have a right to health care that hasn't been invented yet. You can't have a right to a house that isn't built. You can't have a right to education when knowledge has not yet been discovered. the entire thing reduces rights from an inherently individual concept to a concept that only is intelligible in the collective and is mutable and is dependent upon political pressures. So, I mean, I would argue for various reasons. I'm obviously in the negative rights camp, that positive rights are inferior, and they're also, an infringement upon the negative rights, which are actually demonstrably crucial to our existence as a species. But that's sort of beside the point. I think that we really need to get to the root of the matter and say that certain people have certain rights, and all people have all of their human rights. And like you can look at, say, voting rights, for example, which is not a natural right, but a political right or a civil right that's granted to certain people in certain contexts would more closely fit the positive model of a right or a system that is created as a result of a social institution. I mean, you don't have a right to vote if there's no state, for example, and you don't have a right to vote in, say, Belgium's elections if you are an American, one would hope. But I mean, progressives and liberals and many moderates and even some conservatives don't even necessarily understand that. And I think that's incredibly important. So if we're going to make an argument for the pro-life message, the idea is that you have an inherent right not to be killed. And that's it. We don't have to pay for anything else. We don't have to provide you your way through life, but you have a right to try. You have a right to exist, and you have a right to exist unmolested and unaggressed upon. Furthermore, I do want to add some subtlety to the evolutionary take on the nature of sex. The fundamental purpose of sex is obviously reproduction, of course. But at the same time, if we were to take it to the extreme of every time we have sex, it's just supposed to produce a child, it does actually have some other more complex interactions. And that would also not just apply to abortion, but it would also apply not only to various other forms of contraception, like barrier methods or hormonal methods, or even, say, the rhythm method or the coitus interruptus, as many people would call it. But that would also apply to even abstinence, since you have this drive that you're not fulfilling and you're not doing the one thing that you exist to do, supposedly. I mean, I do think that abortion is morally distinct from those other categories of behavior because it's taking a human life. But, I mean, human sexuality is quite interesting, and particularly not all couplings necessarily are supposed to result in actual reproduction. In fact, that's actually a point of interesting contention where you might, for social reasons, particularly if you're a female in a primitive society, need to sleep with one person despite not being particularly attracted to them. That's where the whole... And human sexual dynamics are incredibly strange. But I think that this also gets back to an interesting and fundamental point. In human sexual interaction, sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive. So women are generally the more selective sex. I think that would be an uncontroversial thing to say. And the woman's primary power in the reproductive market is they control when they get pregnant. They control which of the males get to reproduce. The men are generally the people who approach, the people who pursue. Women select. And since that is their primary biological power, that is their central imperative, that like men and women think about sex in different ways. They think about how they reproduce and how they raise children in separate ways. Anything that infringes upon that ability to select in any way is viscerally unpleasant. And I think that's part of the reason why people get so up in arms about abortion. There are plenty of reasons. I mean, people who are up in arms for abortion, I should specify, they feel like if you have any moral qualm about why a woman shouldn't be able to select to not have a pregnancy that she doesn't want for whatever reason, then you're kind of getting at her central power, and that is something that on a primal, instinctive level they do not like. I mean, I've gone on for quite a while. There's plenty more I could talk about on this issue. We haven't even crossed the surface about how some feminists believe that since, it's a uniquely female responsibility, females need to be relieved of that responsibility as part of the fight against the patriarchy, if you want to go to the more radical elements of their belief system. But again, I think I should just let somebody else get a word in edgewise.
Okay, I'll just add that I think it's good that we talked a little bit about that, because I do think it's important to understand sort of evolutionarily where everything does fit in, and that is true. But I think also I would even say when you were talking about abstinence sort of being interrupting that how would I say that? Interrupting or being opposed to the, I guess, biological imperative. I will say this. One, my counter argument, and I don't mean to drag this out any longer, this particular line of talking, but one counter argument would be one that obviously you can only raise so many kids. I mean, at least well, and in the past and even arguably today, like have them all survive and end up having kids of their own. And two, I think that there's a difference between merely not doing something and like engaging in the activity that explicitly exists for the purpose of for a certain purpose, and then killing what is supposed to be the product, killing what is supposed to be the purpose. I think that's, I mean, apart from being more immoral, it's also, I think, significantly more illogical. Or even say engaging in contraceptive methods, because you're still engaging in the act of sex without having the end product. Like you're sort of, to me, there's a difference between not doing it at all and like doing something and then still removing its logical conclusion. I don't mean to drag this out any longer, but yeah, I just thought it would be worth mentioning that. But I agree with you that there is, the concept of abstinence. Yes, you are sort of staying out of what presumably is your biological imperative, but if we're to assume that you're not going to be doing that literally all of the time, I think there is a difference between what you do when you choose to engage in that act.
Yeah, it's like if you bake a cake and then turn around and throw it in the garbage. No one would do that because that is probably the stupidest way to go about cake that I could think of. Not even probably, it is. No one would do that if we were talking about baking a cake. So why, when we're talking about creating humans, would we do it? Because it's illogical when you're talking about literally anything else you might make.
Right, and I think this is another point that's really important to explore if we look at, again, evolutionary history and the evolutionary mechanics behind our reproductive organs and behaviors. So obviously sex is pleasurable, and that's why a lot of people do it. It's actually quite interesting as well. If you take survey data, I believe there was a survey a couple of years ago that asked various couples specifically why they had sex. And of the 8 reasons, baby making was the last of all the reasons. So
there were 8 reasons? What were the others? I mean, I can imagine like 2 or 3 of the other 7. I kind of want to... we don't need to talk about them maybe, but I'm just kind of curious what the other 7 altogether were. I mean,
I'll see if I can find it. I'll send it to you guys afterwards. We can even put it in the description of the video if you would like. But in any case, some of them are predictable, like strengthening the relationship, physical pleasure. But that's sort of beside the point. It's like, I'll make another comparison. This might be a strained metaphor. But for many people, the idea of going to work is not because, I care so much about this particular task, and I'm going to work every day in order to make sure that this task gets completed. Because in some cases, it's like, wow, this task is really annoying. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of my attention. But there's the carrot to go with the stick. They get a paycheck. Now, simultaneously, to push back on this sort of logic of short-circuiting, throwing away the cake. To a lot of people, they're pursuing the paycheck, and they don't actually care that much about the task that inevitably comes with it. So if you tell them they can get like a welfare check instead, it's like, I don't even have to have the side effect. I just get the money. Or I don't even have to raise the kid. I just get to feel good. That is, I think, a more accurate description of what is actually going on.
That's fair, I guess. I mean, I think a lot of people just don't really care about the actual, I guess, what is the biological imperative, because we're in a decadent society in which the biological imperative is not anyone's main concern. But yeah, okay. So one more thing I wanted to make sure we get to, just before we wrap up, and if we have any more comments, we can definitely discuss those too. But one topic I don't want to forget about is we're about to have the only vice presidential debate, and I do think this is going to be a real contrast. Trump and Biden were a real contrast for sure, but they're both old men, right? And they had another old guy be the moderator. I have to say, like, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, they could not be more different. And honestly, I say that in the best possible way for Mike Pence. He's to me, he's a gentleman, but he's also a hardcore social conservative, fiscal conservative too, obviously. But a guy who I think represents the conservative movement pretty well. If maybe a slightly more antiquated, a little bit globalist version of it, but not excessively so. But I'm curious what you guys both think about how abortion is going to fit into this debate. 'Cause I'm sure something like it comes up at some point. They're not going to give Mike Pence a free pass on this because they hate him and his position on abortion, and they're not going to take an opportunity away from Kamala Harris to brag about her position. Even though I would argue it probably would hurt her electorally to make a big deal out of it, she'll probably want to do it anyway.
All right, I'm going to actually push back a little bit on that because I'm going to assume that the people who are running the opposition aren't total morons, which could be very well wrong. I mean, I like to think of them more as completely morally misguided rather than just idiotic, although there's plenty of counterexamples to that. So, in any case, I think if their whole pitch that they're starting to realize is that Biden is way ahead among certain seemingly morally conservative voters because he's not pushing the parts of his agenda that are controversial, the last thing they would want to do is actually bring up the controversial points. So unless Mike Pence actively goes after abortion, I feel like if the moderator and the Biden campaign and Kamala Harris have any sense whatsoever, they're just going to steer clear of this, even though the contrast could not be more obvious.
Of course, I pray that he torches her over and reminds everybody, because people forget this. People forget about her record as Attorney General of California. And when Tulsi Gabbard went after her on it, she did pretty well. She got to most of the points, and it made sense to not go after her for this at the time because it was the Democratic primary. So Democrats would have maybe supported her in doing this. But I really hope Mike Pence reminds the American people that she sent her agents to raid David Daleiden's house at gunpoint after having a meeting with Planned Parenthood executives to protect her blood money because she was getting bribes from Planned Parenthood. I forget exactly what the number was. I think it was $47,000, and Judas only had 30 pieces of silver. I think $47,000 is a lot more. So I guess all right, okay, but he needs to remind her of what she did, why she did it, and just the havoc that it has put on this man's life, and she did it all to protect not only abortion, but her bribes connected to abortion. And really what it is, it's blood money.
I would agree. I think I think that's a fair way to describe it. I also really think that it's important that Pence remind voters of this stuff, because, I mean, one, I think just on a moral level, it's important that we have this conversation, regardless of the electoral impacts. But I think electorally also, a lot of those people who were, I mean, some of them probably aren't bona fides pro-life people. I don't know that they all really believe that, but some of them do. One, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and two, just realistically, you guys can both agree, I'm sure, that when you heard, because did you read the article I sent you, DJ Trump, or at least the stuff I sent you, the excerpts?
Oh, yes, I did. I read it actually several days ago. I just wasn't sure at the beginning of the conversation which article we were talking about, but I read the whole thing.
Yeah, cool. So, and you read it too, The Wolf. Cool. So, you guys see what I'm saying, right? There are some people who, their pro-life position seems kind of sketchy. It doesn't seem super solid, but I imagine if they were reminded, because granted, a lot of people are kind of wishy-washy on abortion, but the thing that gets people, and I think it shouldn't be something that is morally distinct, because I don't really think it's morally different than any other, point of abortion, but when you say that the governor of Virginia and his legislature agreed on a bill that I believe did end up passing, that says that a child can be born and you don't even have to treat that child, and when the Democrats lead a charge in the Senate to defeat a bill that is going to protect children who are born alive and make sure they get the same amount of medical care and the same type of medical care that children naturally born at that gestational age would get if they hadn't been the products of failed abortions. I mean, I think that it's important to see that that kind of stuff doesn't sit well with even among people who call themselves pro-choice. A lot of them don't really want that. A lot of them don't even want any abortions during the third trimester. And while I think morally there's really not a difference, I can see how if you're truly uneducated about the issue, it's easy to see that there might be a difference or think there might be. And regardless, I think we need to capitalize on that. People aren't perfect. We shouldn't expect them to be, honestly. But we can at least try to take what they have that is good, their good instincts, and we need to basically pressure them on them, and they might change their votes. And I think that that's something that Mike Pence can do. I think it's something he's capable of doing. And again, in a very polite way that's not going to piss people off. I mean, it'll piss the left off, of course, but isn't going to piss off the people he needs to win. Because, one of his weaknesses, I would say a little bit, but even greater in this case, strengths, is that he's kind of a nice guy. And it's hard for people to demonize him. And that's one of the things that I find very amusing and found very amusing in his 2016 debate, was that it was very hard for Tim Kaine to basically jump all over him, because he was just basically brushed everything off and was very polite. And, again, still basically, ran Kaine through the ringer on the actual issues. But in any case, that's all for me. If you guys have any final thoughts, we'll probably wrap this up just to keep it at a decent length.
Just one point, because I think this is really important to circle back to the thing about the consistent life ethic, is even if you're operating under the assumption that we should be providing people with health care or whatever, I'll just use an example of people with disabilities because it's what I know. If people with disabilities, and I'm referring to born people with disabilities, our biggest problem is abortion. Because what happens is you have these services given to people with disabilities, like for them, but with the abortion rates as high as they are, then you have what was I going to say? Oh, then you kind of look at that as the solution, and it goes in a supply and demand thing for these services. So, and because of abortion, the demand is way lower. Nobody is fighting for these services, and nobody's asking for these services, so the demand is way lower. So the supply turns way lower because, and this is an unfortunate reality, but it seems often to fight for people with disabilities, you need to either have a disability or have someone in your family have a disability. That's just an unfortunate reality that most people who are disability rights activists are in some way connected, and you don't really do it like just because it's the right thing to do. So abortion it's really robbing people with disabilities, born people with disabilities, of help that they could be getting if the world was more accustomed to them. And the reason the world isn't so accustomed to them is because like, in the conservative estimate, 67% of them are getting killed, and that's the most conservative estimate. So I'd say that's our biggest problem, because it drives all of the other problems.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I think you're describing the eugenic effect of abortion, and while that's also morally heinous, I think you're also pointing out one of the big pragmatic problems, and I like that you're bringing up a pragmatic problem, because as much as it kind of disgusts all of us to have to think about, oh, well, there are pragmatic issues too. That's not the focus any of us wants to have, but I think it's also something, one, that can be persuasive, but two, is equally problematic on a day-to-day basis, even if I would argue it's perhaps a little less morally significant than the idea of just killing people. But just, again, you're bringing up the moral issue also. They're killing people just because they're seen as not as human. They're not quite as human, apparently, because they have some disability. So I really appreciate you brought that up, The Wolf, and I thank you for coming on. Any last words, DJ Trump?
Yeah, and maybe and this is a thing for a different podcast probably, but I could go on a whole rant about the Nazi euthanasia program and about how Ernst Rudin, who was the mastermind of it, was friends with Margaret Sanger, and I could go into that whole rant, but I'm not going to do that now because we're kind of pressed for time, but I could.
I would love to have you on again, and we can talk about those issues and sort of the interplay between a lot of American progressives and between a lot of the Nazi eugenicists. But yes, we should do that some other time. Thanks for bringing it up, though. That's a great idea. DJ Trump, any quick last words?
All right, I'll try and keep this brief. I mean, life is the most fundamental of our virtues. It's the most fundamental right we have. It's the good from which all other goods stem. And abortion is basically the most egregious violation of that you could possibly imagine. It is a life being terminated before it's even left the womb. It's a unique human person with their own genes. There's so much of who they're going to be is already part of them. I mean, even before they have a heartbeat, you can know what kind of foods they're going to prefer. You can know with a high degree of confidence some of the things they're going to be interested in if they were to develop. And that sort of perversion of a mother killing a child in the womb before it even has a chance to grow and be its own real person in the real world is morally repugnant, and nobody in good conscience should be able to support it in any way. And I suppose that's my summary of the pro-life issue.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you both for coming on. My favorite co-host, DJ Trump, and then my guest, The Wolf, and then, again, I'm George. Thank you for listening to The Vanguard, and we hope to have you listen again soon. Thank you to our listeners.